Alright, so today we're going back to deductive and inductive arguments. And why are we returning to this material? Well, there's a lot of different aspects of deductive and inductive arguments. Your book spreads it out over several different chapters. And that's because students typically have a difficult time grasping all this. This takes a while to get down. In part because one of the things that we're going to look at today goes against your natural instincts when it comes to arguments. If you're like other students, your first instinct when you get in an argument, after you've figured out what is the conclusion, what are the premises, is to start asking, is this true, is this true, is this true? And that sometimes is a good course to take. That can simplify a lot of things. But oftentimes that won't tell you whether you're dealing with a good argument or not. Especially if you're asked to find out whether somebody is reasoning correctly. The act of reasoning, it's not really dependent on whether the premises or the conclusion happen in this case to be true or false. It's dependent on the form or the structure of the argument. So you can make an argument that's good, at least insofar as it's got good structure, but it has false premises. Let me give you an example. Let's do something very, off the wall, something completely ludicrous. If Dr. Sadler cancels class, the world will end. So there's a premise. Clearly false, right? I have canceled class before, the world didn't end. Where do we want to go with this? Let's do a different kind of argument with this. We'll do, the world has not ended, therefore, Dr. Sadler has not canceled class. Okay, so if Dr. Sadler cancels class, the world will end. The world is not ending. Therefore, Dr. Sadler has not canceled class. Now, in one respect, this is a good argument. If these premises were actually true, that conclusion would have to follow. Just so happens they're not actually true. Well, the world is not ended, that's true, right? But when we talk about the premises being true, we mean all of the premises being true. This is what you call a logically valid deductive argument. When we use the word valid in critical thinking, we mean that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It's a certain way of talking about arguments. And to be valid is good. Now, in this case, it's not completely good because one of the premises is false. And so you have a false conclusion too, right? It could actually be a true conclusion. If I hadn't canceled class that day, that my strut spring broke and then punctured my tire and then I had to cancel class. Remember that day? If that wasn't the case, this would actually be true. You would have a true conclusion. There would be one false premise in there. The problem with that argument would only be that one of the premises was false. And that's something that we call either sound or unsound. So we're going to lay that out in a moment. Same thing with inductive arguments. They can be good arguments if the premises would make the conclusion likely, even if the premises are false. So you want to be careful with this. Your first inclination when you encounter an argument is almost always going to be, until you're trained, until you make yourself practice, to start looking to see what's true and to start worrying about that. Before you start worrying about whether anything's true, you want to get yourself to the point where you can identify arguments as good or bad, as valid, invalid, strong or weak, depending on their form. That's what people are actually going to hire you to do when you're processing information. because they can find somebody else to go out and do the research to find out whether things are true or false. They want to know, do the premises actually lead to the conclusion? What can you actually infer from it? So when we have arguments, by now this is familiar to you, we have deductive arguments and we have inductive arguments, right? And we've talked about what's the difference between these. Deductive arguments, what words do you associate with a deductive argument? You guys should be able to answer this. What terms do you look for? If nothing comes to mind, this is a sign that you need to put in more time studying. Because you're not ready for class. If you're not ready for class, you're not going to get as much out of it. What words come to mind? Deductive arguments. All, yeah. All is one of the words that's likely to show up in premises or in the conclusion. All human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That all, that's what gets you to another term like must, right? Or none, never, or necessarily. What about inductive arguments? Well, should can be a moral argument, and that can be in deductive arguments.
Usually?
Usually, yeah, usually, or what are other synonyms for that?
Sometimes.
Sometimes does not give you a strong inductive argument. Actually, sometimes could be used in either deductive or inductive arguments. So it's not, sometimes is not actually indicating one or the other. What else? What's like usually? Most, yes. For the most part.
Typically?
Very good. Typically. Probably. Probably is the one you'll probably see the most. Or likely. Odds are. Those sorts of things. Those are what you should associate with inductive arguments. I gave you the idea that when you're, last time we talked about this, when you're listening to people say things, you should be deciding, in your head, this is the way you practice this material outside of class. Am I listening to deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning? Is somebody making a deductive argument or an inductive argument? You want to start doing that. I'm not giving these tidbits away just, as pure suggestions. If you want to pass this class, this is something you have to master. So deductive arguments. Now they can come, your book is not the most clear about this, unfortunately. Some other textbooks are more clear. Your book talks about arguments being valid, right? It doesn't talk an awful lot about invalid. But, if something can be valid, it can also be invalid. Inductive arguments, if they're good arguments, we use a different term. We call them strong. So if you hear somebody out there talking about an inductive argument being valid, they're using the term in a loose, maybe even sloppy, careless way. Because inductive arguments aren't valid. They're strong, or what's the opposite of strong? Weak, right. And at this level, here we've decided what kind of argument are we dealing with? Now there's another question you can ask. If the premises are true, is the conclusion true? Is it necessarily true, like in a valid deductive argument, or is it likely to be true? That's what tells you whether it's strong or weak, or valid or invalid. And that's not about whether the premises actually are true. That's about if they were true, hypothetically. if those premises were true, would it lead to the conclusion being true? Professor, we'll take one of the invalid arguments that we used several class sessions ago. All professors are diligent in their work. All terrorists are diligent in their work. Therefore, professors are terrorists. There's something wrong with that structure. How do you know that there's something wrong with it? Well, can those premises be true and the conclusion false? Yeah, as a matter of fact, in that case, that is the reality of it. Well, not all professors are diligent in their work. I'll admit that. And I would be willing to bet there's some terrorists that are screw-ups. You know, they get kicked out, or they get assigned the lowest tasks. They're the ones that are always mopping. You know, when do I get to go and engage in terrorist activity? Just stick to the mopping. You know, somebody hijacked a bus last night.
In Raleigh.
Oh, really?
Well, I think it was going to Raleigh, outside of Henderson, but he was letting everybody off at every stop. So, I mean, he was getting rid of all of
Not much of a hijacker, I suppose. But
they tasered him at a stop and got rid of him. So.
Well, I don't know if that was terrorism, but why did you spend somebody desperate, you know, to do something? Now, we can also ask then, are the premises actually true? And we ask that question after we decide whether it's valid or invalid, or strong or weak. And there we're dealing with a different level of question. Are the premises actually true? Now, if the argument's invalid, it's a bad argument. Do we need to go further and ask whether the premises are true with a bad argument? To find out whether it's a good or bad argument.
Repeat that one more time.
Invalid arguments are bad arguments. Okay. Do we need to go any further to decide whether it's a good or bad argument by looking at whether the premises are true? It should be a no-brainer. Everybody should be saying it in unison. No. You already know it's a bad argument. So then you go on to the valid argument. Well, the valid argument, if the premises are actually true, we call it sound. So you can have a sound valid argument. You can also have an unsound valid argument. So if you are 158 years old, I will give you $100. You're 158 years old, here you go, here's $100. None of you are 158 years old. That's an unsound but valid argument. It's valid because if those premises were true, that conclusion would follow. It would follow necessarily. It just so happens they're not true. They're not true in the case of anybody. Nobody we know of lives to 158. Now we have the same thing over here. We have another term, cogent, not cogent. Weak arguments are bad arguments. You don't have to tell whether a weak argument, whether the premises are true or not. So for example, if somebody's making an inductive argument, but they're using words like sometimes, some, could be, possibly, that's a bad argument. You shouldn't rest anything on that. You know, sometimes people get on buses and hijack them. Here's a bus. I'd better watch out for the person who's going to hijack it. Or I likely have to watch out for the person who hijacks it. That's a bad argument. You don't have enough grounds to support the conclusion. And the premises don't lead with any sort of degree of likelihood to the conclusion. Hypochondriacs are like this, aren't they? What are hypochondriacs?
scared of something.
People who are scared of something, and what are they scared of? Phobiacs are scared, that's the broad category. What are hypochondriacs scared of?
Usually some type of illness.
Diseases and stuff.
Illnesses, diseases, yeah. And they go a little bit further and they think that they actually have them, right? So the hypochondriac, they get a little sniffle and they draw the conclusion, and they're going through a process of reasoning. I'm going to die, you know, unless I get to the doctor. And doctors have to deal with a lot of hypochondriacs. What's wrong with the hypochondriac is a bad process of reasoning. And it might be deductive. I have the sniffles. Anybody who has the sniffles has bubonic plague. I don't know if that's the symptom of it, but let's just say it is. I have it, therefore I must have bubonic plague. You know, they diagnose themselves. They go to WebMD. You guys are familiar with WebMD? If you get sick and you can't go to the doctor, one of your resources is to look up your symptoms on WebMD. One of the problems with that is you may be misdiagnosed. Because if you're your own doctor, that's sort of like being your own lawyer. You know, you don't actually have the qualifications. So you don't know whether you have bubonic plague or pneumonia or bronchitis or whatever. So yeah, the hypochondriac is engaged in a bad process of reasoning. Actually, you could take any mental disorder and you could look at it in terms of a deficient process of reasoning. The paranoia, for example. What is it to be paranoid? What does that mean?
Unreasonable fear or something.
What's that?
Unreasonable fear or something.
Well, it's not just unreasonable fear. Again, that's phobiac. That's a much broader category.
You believe something's going to happen, whether it is or not.
Well, that's a part of it, believing that something is going to happen, whether it is or not. But what's distinctive about the paranoid? If somebody's paranoid, you guys should learn these things. This is part of a college education. Knowing all these terms, right? You might want to get one of those, vocabulary word-a-day calendars or something.
Scared something's going to happen.
Yeah, the paranoid is scared that something is going to happen. The paranoid is scared that other people are out to get them, whether they are or not. There's an old joke, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean other people aren't out to get you. Now the paranoid is very often drawing deductively valid conclusions. It just so happens that their premises turn out to be false. For instance, if somebody looks at you and they don't smile, does that mean they're out to get you? The paranoid thinks they are. So the paranoid, you look at the paranoid and you don't smile, and the paranoid thinks, they didn't smile at me. When people don't smile at you, that means that they hate you. People who hate you are going to try to kill you. That person's going to try to kill me. What they've done is they've engaged in logical deduction, but they started from bad premises. So actually there's nothing wrong with their argument at this point, because if it was really the case, let's see how do we reconstruct this. If it was really the case that if somebody doesn't smile at you, that means they hate you. And if they hate you, then they're going to kill you. If those were really true, that conclusion would follow, wouldn't it? That you looked at me without a smile, you're going to kill me. So it is valid, but it's not sound. So unsound arguments are also bad arguments. When you make generalizations, think about the way stereotyping works. We've used that as an example several times in this class. You begin with a certain preconception about people, having to do with most of them, not all of them. Who do you want to pick on today? We'll use it as an example. Anybody you like. Let's pick a profession this time, instead of race, gender.
Policeman.
Policeman, okay. So, we want to make an argument about police, we could do this very easily with TV, couldn't we? Because most people have encountered, well, you can't really say encountered, can you? Most people have seen the behavior of police on TV more than they have in real life. Because we watch a lot of television, and yeah. Now, it could be different. You might be the exception of the case. We're making a generalization here, right? And if you do that sort of thing, if you're drawing on television as your main source of understanding about police, what sort of characteristics might you think police officers have? Take, for example, shows like CSI, and now, lie to me, he's not really a police officer, but he's interacting with a lot of police officers. And there's other shows like that too. Law and Order, you know, that's a good example. They have lots of cops on that.
Detroit 187.
What's that?
Detroit 187.
Okay, so you've got a bunch of different cop shows. What do they do whenever there's a case? Gather a lot of evidence, right? It goes to the DNA lab, you know, it comes back within a couple days. We've got the DNA, we're going to go catch this guy. He's the rapist, he's the murderer, or something like that. Now, that's not the reality of things. I mean, the backlog for some DNA labs, some state DNA labs, goes back years. That's not the way police procedure actually works. They don't take DNA in every case. They're not following up every single case all the time. But you could come to a wrong conclusion by watching a lot of television. And, you know, now somebody robs you. So you're expecting, when you make that call, that the police officers who come out are going to be an awful lot like the cops on TV, right?
Fingerprinting and...
Exactly, yeah.
That happened to me. I thought they were going to, and they're like, we don't do that. And I was like, wow.
Yeah, they only do it in very special cases. Now, your assumption that they were going to do that was actually the conclusion of an inductive argument. And that's a strong argument. If the data that you're beginning with was good data, if you had a lot of contact with actual police, then it would have been a cogent argument as well. Now, if you actually know a lot of real police, you don't expect an awful lot out of police. And they'll tell you, yeah, we don't solve a lot of the crimes. Some of the categories, yeah, some of the categories of crime, we don't have the time, we don't have the resources. Even if we did, we probably wouldn't find who did it. You know, there's a lot of things like that. So that's a good example of an inductive argument that could be very strong, but not cogent. I noticed this when I taught in the prisons as well. Where do most people get their ideas of prisons from? What's that?
Probably police.
Most people get their ideas of prisons from police? Movies, yeah. None really come to mind offhand. Cool Hand Luke, I guess. That's pretty dated, though. What else? There's TV shows, right? And some of those TV shows are somewhat better than others. Like, you know, Prison Break. Do you think, you know, if that's where your idea of prison comes from, or Oz, you're probably going to have a very skewed understanding. And then, you know, you may have a strong argument, but it's probably not going to be cogent. Or you might make good deductive arguments that are probably going to be unsound. What about if you watch MSNBC Lockup? Think that's representative? It's not. I actually have a friend who was interviewed for MSNBC Lockup. He was very disappointed. Aaron Brown. He was at Indiana State Prison, where I think he still is. I got a letter from him recently. And he was my tutor. He's doing a very long sentence. He will get out probably in his 70s. And in his 70s.
In his 70s.
Yes.
Oh.
And he was a very good student. So eventually I made him my tutor, and we got to be very good friends. And so he told me about this experience of being interviewed for MSNBC lockup. And they had lots and lots and lots of footage. This is what they do on these kind of shows. Lots of footage. And then he was very disappointed to find out that about 90% of the things that he said didn't actually make it in. And what they did show of him was not bad. I mean, if you actually watch his clip, you're going to see that he's quite a bit different than some of the other guys in there.
What did he do?
He killed his parents. Still doesn't know why. When he was 16. And by the time I met him, he was 26. And now, how old is he now? He's in his 30s. It's
You weren't scared
interesting.
of him?
Go ahead.
You weren't scared of him?
No, I wasn't scared of the prison. This is kind of a sideline. For the Ball State Prison program, in the entire history of the program, no professor was ever attacked. And we taught thousands of prison students. As a matter of fact, when the riots took place in Newcastle prison, there were Indiana prisoners and then there were Arizona prisoners because Indiana was leasing out space. And the Arizona prisoners rioted, and the Indiana prisoners actually escorted the professors through the riot zone to the safe zone. So education in prisons is something the prisoners take it very seriously. They don't take it for granted at all. They see it as one of the few good things available to them. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to prisons, even shows like MSNBC Lockup, you might be working with false premises if you're going by a show like that. It's very difficult actually to tell what something is like until you start studying it. Not just watching TV about it, but actually studying it. We've got something right now that we're having a very difficult time making sense of. Some news that's probably the most important thing in the world going on right now. It's going to affect your lives, the rest of your lives. There's a revolution happening in the Arab world. I don't know if you've been following this story. I have one news article about that up here right now. The Obama administration is trying to make sense out of things. Reporters are trying to make sense out of things. People on the ground in Egypt, in Tunisia, and Yemen, and Jordan are trying to make sense of things. They're making arguments back and forth to each other. Their arguments have to do with things that really matter. Should they live under democracies? Should they live under tyrannies? Should we keep sending military aid to them? We were sending aid to the guy who they're rioting against. As a matter of fact, the tear gas canisters, this is not good press for us. The tear gas canisters that these rioters are picking up all say "Made in the USA." That doesn't look good. You know why? Because we require, as part of our military aid package, that they buy things from us. So that's what they bought. A lot of people are making arguments about what's going on. One issue in Egypt, a lot of people are very worried what's going to happen there. The only other group that's very well organized besides the government is a group called the Islamic Brotherhood. Does anybody know anything about them? You should, because again, it's going to affect your lives. So part of a college education, broadening your horizons. People are making arguments back and forth about this. If we actually hold elections in Egypt, the Islamic Brotherhood is the only non-government group that has any sort of organization. So what might you predict about how the elections would turn out? Yeah, they'd probably win. Or maybe they'll form a coalition with the other parties. The problem is the Islamic Brotherhood is one of these radical Islamic groups that is not very democratic in its aims. So people are making predictions. For instance, if we hold free elections in Egypt, which haven't been held for a long time, they've had elections but not free ones, then the Islamic Brotherhood will win. And if the Islamic Brotherhood wins, that means they will impose an Islamic state and there won't be any elections. So therefore, what's your last name? Mark? Okay. We'll talk after class. So therefore, if they hold free elections, they won't be very free for long. That's a deductive argument, isn't it? If those premises are true, does that conclusion follow? It's a valid deductive argument. Do we know whether the premises are true or not? I mean, I do, because I actually know something about the stuff on the ground. This is where things get very difficult. This is why I want to point out to you why, instead of looking to see whether premises are true or not, you should start getting in the habit of asking yourself, does this actually have good structure? Because very often you don't know whether the premises are true until you've done the research, do you? So this one you couldn't decide. Now if I made an argument that was clearly invalid about the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt, then you could take that down, couldn't you? Even without knowing whether the premises are true. This goes also for things in your personal life. If somebody makes the argument that you should buy a car from so-and-so, anytime somebody makes a claim that you should buy a car from so-and-so, your alarm bell should be going off, right? Because what do you know about car dealerships in general and what's that? Shady, yeah. Quite a few of them are. Buying a car can often be very complicated. There's a contract that you have to sign. You know, the first thing they do once they see that you like that car is usually, let's start talking financing. How many of you would say you understand financing very, very well? I'll bet there's a few. Probably the older students who've engaged in this before. Well, you know, this entire thing applies here too. If you start talking and making claims about whether you should buy this car or not, that car dealership is making an argument to you. You want to figure out whether that's a good argument or a bad argument. Before you even start worrying about whether the premises are true, whether they're lying to you or not, you may not even know. I mean, we have ways of finding things out now about cars that we didn't have in the past, like, say, Carfax. Right? Yeah, Consumer Reports helps you not with a specific car, but with a line of cars, right? It doesn't tell you whether this car was flooded. Carfax does supposedly tell you that. I've never used it, so I can't actually say that it does or not, can I?
That really ain't that good, because you can take a car that never reaches the insurance company.
Mm-hmm.
See,
Carfax looks for insurance claims, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I know one instance where there's an 07 Cobalt
Yeah.
that has been completely totaled, but it never went to insurance. Therefore, it does not have no history.
Sure. Yeah, let's think about how that might fit in. Somebody might make an argument, said a 07 Cobalt. This 07 Cobalt is a really good car, right? I'm selling you the car now, I'm on the lot, and you say, I don't know, I want to see the Carfax report. So I get the Carfax report out. I say, look, nothing wrong with it. And I say, you know, if there was any sort of problem, it would show up on the Carfax report. Then you realize, well, that's not really the case. It's likely that it would show up on the Carfax report if it actually went to the insurance agency and everything was filled out properly and it went through the system and nobody monkeyed with it. This is actually, you know, the Carfax report for this car. Maybe you check the VIN numbers, you know. Yeah, okay, it is the one for this car. Now you're starting to make an inductive argument. And again, worry about whether it's a strong or weak argument before you start worrying about, are these premises actually true? As soon as you start having to make a lot of qualifications, you're weakening the inductive argument that you originally started with. Eventually, so the nice thing about inductive arguments as opposed to deductive arguments, the more evidence that you find, the stronger it becomes. The more counter evidence, the weaker it becomes. Or the more that evidence can be called into question, the weaker it becomes. Now, next class, we're going to look at other features of inductive and deductive arguments, where we're not just going to look at these general classifications. You do need to know all these terms. This is how you figure out what kind of argument you're dealing with. This is core to critical thinking. Being able to tell whether you're dealing with an unsound, valid argument or a cogent, strong argument. That's going to be something that you have to master. The best way to do it is by looking at arguments and asking yourself, where does it actually fit on here? Somebody gives you an argument, you start asking, first question, is it deductive or inductive? What kind of argument are you dealing with? What sort of strength are they claiming for the connection between them? Then start asking, if the premises were true, would the conclusion have to follow from it? Would the conclusion be true? Don't ask, are the premises actually true yet? Then start asking, okay, are the premises actually true? That'll allow you to figure out what kind of argument you're dealing with. Learning how to classify arguments is an important part of critical thinking. Next class, we're going to look at argument forms. I have a handout for you in Blackboard for deductive argument forms and some inductive forms, and we're going to spend the whole class session looking at that. And again, that's stuff that you're not used to doing. So you have to practice it, because it does not go along with the way that you are used to thinking about arguments and claims that people make. So you want to practice a lot with this material.